One of the nice things about being a historian is that you are the open and willing arms of everything that the past has thrown towards their idea of a future with the hope that somebody would be there to receive it. You're the audience. You're the understanding ear, the wary eye that will analyze and understand what was there and provide context to your contemporaries and even people of the future who you yourself are throwing things over to. And as somebody who works in computer history, no set of information has exceeded the payload, the value, and the amazement of Shareware CD-ROMs. This is Jason Scott. You're listening to the Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It podcast, a podcast about history, technology, and getting myself out of debt. Thanks to Jeff Atwood, Daniel Boyd, and the hundreds of other supporters on Patreon, PayPal, LibrePay, and any other platform I can find for helping make this podcast possible. Right now, the Internet Archive has thousands of CD-ROMs up there. Some of them are CD-ROM images of commercial programs, but some of them are compilation CDs, or what we call Shareware CDs of the 1990s. And the story of how those came about is actually pretty weird, and the fact that they are so vital to understanding computer history even before the 1990s is itself, to me, a fascinating subject. I've talked about it before, but it never ceases to amaze me that this random assortment of companies doing basically low-grade shoveling of data onto plastic disks turned out to be some of the most vibrant, useful, and referenceable data about computer history that we may ever experience. Now, don't let me discount all the other efforts around computer history before the 1990s. There are archives of printed papers and menus. There's documentation stores. We have those manuals that are of such high quality about the processes and thinking of companies, along with contextual information, engineering notebooks and marketing materials that people have kept around. And you can experience these around the country at various archives. They're sitting in boxes. Some of them have been scanned in, many have not, and you can read up on what got us to this point. But there's something about the fact that Shareware CDs existed and came into existence that really changed the course of understanding computers and how they work. Let's step back. CD-ROMs are a technology that existed through the 1980s, but they existed as a sort of possibility. Right now in the contemporary space, we have what are called Quartz cubes, and people are taking quartz and etching it, and they're able to get CD-ROM level density onto a small cube, and that provides them with essentially permanent storage. The idea that quartz will not decay in any way, that it will last for thousands of years. We can set aside what sort of information is worth being around for thousands of years, but quartz cubes exist right now, and certainly throughout the 1980s, CD-ROMs existed, but it was a while before we had the amount of commercial backing and the release of commercial products onto CD-ROMs to where they became something that anybody would be able to use, and then even further along where people could master their own and not have it cost them thousands of dollars. And you always see this very interesting period. It's in laser discs, it's in CD-ROMs, it'll be in whatever's next, where people can master and create these bulks of information, but then it's so expensive that only the wild ones or the weird ones or the ones that are guaranteed smash hits show up initially. There are CD-ROMs at the beginning, roughly 1988, 89, which exist mostly just to sell the idea of a CD-ROM. They are classical recordings or sound recordings, and they're just meant to show you that you wouldn't have the tape hiss or the background buzzing or a lot of the other aspects of analog tape and records. and that you would be able to replay this over and over and over again without losing any of that signal fidelity. What's scary about us is how quickly we gain interest in this new medium, whatever it is, and then we can't stand to look at the old medium. Right now, for instance, I'm looking at mini DV tapes from the BBS Documentary era, around 2002 to 2004 when I was recording interviews. And the mini DV format was a digital video format that recorded to standard definition. And at the time, I thought it was beyond awesome. And we spent a good amount of money to buy the camera, both myself and my wife's family. And the resulting images, I used to say that you could aim a Canon XL1 at a blank wall, and when you looked at it on the tape, it was like looking at the Sistine Chapel. This turns out to be an oversell, but I recorded over 200 interviews using this camera, and while the fidelity is pretty good, it is definitely stuck in the early 2000s. In the same way, analog recording before CD-ROMs allowed you to accept a certain level of hum and cassette tapes. Nothing compared to 8-track tapes or half-inch tape or any of the other analog formats. But we took it, we understood it wasn't so great, but we didn't mind. And CD-ROMs were meant to be the revolution. And along the way, as a side mention, it was also promoted as a data storage. That is to say, you'd be able to put 600 megabytes of data onto a CD-ROM, and it would be able to be read from all the time, which was such a bargain in an era of 10, 20, and 50 megabyte hard drives. You couldn't hope to afford the amount of space that was sitting on one simple plastic disc. And buying a CD-ROM drive changed everyone's relationship to certain kinds of information. In college, I remember we had some computers set up, and those computers had multiple CD-ROM drives. And you could ask from the front desk for a reader service CD-ROM and be able to look up the articles and authors and subjects about everything in mainstream press and be able to get it back instantly. Now, all you'd get would be the name, the title, and maybe an abstract, but that was incredible at the time. The ability to look at what was written in the last year about this given movie and then being able to walk over and then to know immediately which magazine and which title had the information you wanted, this was magical stuff. We're going to forget how hard it was, but that's what we do. So the phenomenon that happened, on which all of what I'm talking about absolutely rests on, is the fact that at 600 megabytes, 700 if you were good, you could go through a lot of computer data really quickly. We just weren't generating, as a species, enough digital data to fill disks that came out with the amount of regularity they started to in the 1990s. You could go on to something like Usenet, which was a text-producing machine, take all of the messages being written or take all of the binaries being posted and put them on a CD-ROM and then sell them to people for anywhere between $10 and $100. But you would run out. So what happened is that they started to go after the bulletin boards, both as customers and as sources of information. If you were running a bulletin board system and you wanted something that was an easy feature to promise people, you could buy a CD-ROM, buy a CD-ROM drive, hook it up, and then instantly have thousands upon thousands of files ready to download on your board. So come on in, maybe pay the fee that it costs to come on my board, and you will have access to hundreds of megabytes, maybe even the magical word, gigabytes of information. And bulletin board systems that were trying to make some sort of profitable go at it would need to have something like 5 or 10 CD-ROM drives hooked up with all sorts of data stores on them. The companies that produced these kind of CD-ROMs, these Shareware CD-ROMs, they had names like Walnut Creek and Wayzata Technology and so much Shareware. And those companies would sell you CD-ROMs for anywhere between $20, $30, $40. And for a while, they were an industry. I have very strong memories in Massachusetts of going on down to the Micro Center and finding the CD-ROM section. And in the CD-ROM section would be a whole range of the newest sets of shareware, programs, movies, music, you name it, all designed for you to get a massive information on the plastic disc, or, as time went on, sets of plastic discs, and take it home and have all of it right there. Obviously, there were things like Linux that really drove shareware CDs because Linux was a very large program. It wasn't just a matter of the kernel. You'd want to have all of the supporting open source modules, the ability to run certain kinds of applications. And so those would come on even more CDs. And then everything would have to be updated because of security and bug fixes and improvements. So then you had what you needed, a subscription style access to the month's improvement in Linux and FreeBSD and so on. And that CD-ROM mouth was always hungry. So companies started to download every piece of shareware they could find on every bulletin board system that was out there. And when they found sets of shareware that had been around in the 1980s, it didn't matter. Bring that stuff in. When they found old text files or old documents or anything involving computers and information, if it fit on the shareware CD, they shoved it on the shareware CD. I've gone through millions of shareware CD files, and you'd be surprised what got scooped up. Little experiments that people did, weird games someone wrote for one bulletin board system, combinations of GIFs grabbed from video signals or done by hand, and then packaged up as a set of pictures of computers, or a set of pictures of women, or a set of pictures of cars, and then turned into just one more file in thousands of files on a shareware CD. It was like a never-ending time capsule of everything 1980s and 1990s. It all sounds so basic now, but so few people were doing this. We didn't have the technology to do scans of newspapers to the quality that we have now. We didn't have the ability to grab the amount of video data coming through television stations and through industrial films and then turn them into digital signals and upload them. Even those simple mini DV tapes I mentioned, those are 13 gigabytes an hour. That was beyond imagining for putting onto a computer. So we have these specially made compact programs and information that people created to go over modems, and they were being put onto these massive discs and then given to us for a relative song. We're now 20 years beyond the red-hot world of shareware CD and the CD-ROM industry, but at a time it was amazingly competitive, and people would put all of these selling points on the back that almost became magic spells for how they were mumbled, BBS ready, hundreds of thousands of hours of blank, thousands of blank, whatever it was, files, pictures, movies, whatever they were promising. And then after that, they'd have artwork that it's just glorious to look at, the kind of science fiction-y, cartoony, hybrid, weird kind of get-your-eye images that went by. At the time, they're using basically Macintoshes and vector art, but there were some real eye-openers in terms of, come on over, grab this 600 megabytes, over 1 gigabyte when you unpack it. There's 4 CDs in this package. It was just this boardwalk of screaming carnival barkers trying to tell you that this CD-ROM was going to be the be-all, end-all of your shareware experience. Shareware CDs are, in fact, not just a collection of programs. In many cases, they're actually kind of hundreds and hundreds of to-do lists. That is to say, you'd get the program from a Shareware CD-ROM, and then you would find out that you actually had to unpack it, set it up, get it ready, do some settings, read the documents, then you'd have your program. And maybe it would turn out that that program sucked, and then you'd have to move on to the next one. This is part of the problem that we're experiencing now in trying to go back through these things, because they are, in fact, not always self-explanatory. I mean, the art is always self-explanatory, but the items within it, not so easy. One of my biggest points of pride with the emulation in a browser is that after a while I thought, well, if you can open up any program and look at it in the browser, that means a robot can do it. And so was born the Screen Shotgun, the script that goes ahead and runs these programs, takes lots of screenshots, and then kind of figures out which one's the most interesting, and then puts that up and then makes the other screenshots available after only plucking out the unique ones. This has been incredibly important in being able to even glance at what's working, what's not, what's interesting, what's not. Of course, the racy stuff always bubbles up to the top, but there's a lot of other programs that turn out to be things like card games and weird utilities for understanding bicycle repair and taking care of your baby that probably would now be 100% lost, because who has time to go through all these things? It turns out computers have all the time in the world. The Internet Archive has something like 7,000 to 10,000 CD-ROMs up now, and of those, hundreds and hundreds of them are Shareware CD-ROMs, the Walnut Creeks and the Wayzatas. But there are also all sorts of one-off Shareware CD creations that were put as part of books or included as part of a user group, and then you would sign up for the user group. They'd send you copies of the CD-ROMs. You know, there's actually libraries of information out there that are in danger of being shunted to the side. So it has been my mission to get as much of this world up as possible and then see what comes of it. And isn't it wonderful when you think about it? The idea that someone, slaves away at an EGA PC screen in 1984, puts together something like a fun little Pac-Man clone, maybe adds a few little features of their own, maybe includes their kids' names in it, and then they upload that zip to a couple BBSs in their local area. And then they forget about it. And then over time, those collections of shareware from those BBSs are added into larger collections, which themselves become even larger collections until finally they're scooped up by some shareware CD creator who's just trying to fill a disk, which itself is then imaged in the 21st century and then put up on a bank of machines to which the entire world could connect and see this one simple program. And then a browser, an idea that could not have even come to this person's mind in 1984, this browser loads up and plays the computer program inside of a virtual computer program running inside of the browser, which then takes pictures of it and then puts those pictures together and makes them available so that you'll know immediately about this Pac-Man clone that's been around for 30 plus years and which will live again, being played by people long after the creator is gone. What a great arc. What an amazing thing. And I know it sounds really weird, but what really kicked things into high gear with the Shareware CD-ROMs on the Internet Archive was when I announced that I really wanted all of the AOL CD-ROMs. There are something like 5,000 or 6,000 variations of AOL CD-ROMs. Yes, it's true. And luckily, they all have individual serial numbers. But I have been contacting all sorts of people who have collections, and then we've been imaging them, scanning the front and putting them up on the Internet Archive. And that news was so weird that it made a bunch of technical press. And there were people who thought it was the stupidest thing in the world. But what it really did was it caused a bunch of people to go, well, I have AOL CD-ROMs, but I also have all of these Shareware CD-ROMs. Would you like them? And I would always say yes. And one day, the founder of Walnut Creek contacted me and said, hey, I've got all of my old CDs. Would you like them for your project? And I said, absolutely, sir. And I drove my rental car down south from the Internet Archive to where the founder of Walnut Creek was living. And he and I went into the garage, and there were boxes and boxes of these things. And he said, my wife wanted me to throw these things out years ago, but I knew that there'd be a museum who wanted them someday. And I was more than happy to be that museum. So we loaded them into my car. It was about a carload. And I drove it back to the Internet Archive and sorted through it. And there were variations that hadn't existed anywhere online before. There were unusually made ones. And there were a lot of doubles and triples. And so I separated them out and immediately contacted my pals at the Computer History Museum and the Strong Museum and said, hey, I've got doubles. Would you like the doubles? And they said yes, and those were all mailed to them. And then one by one, we imaged all of those Walnut Creeks, and all of the unique ones are on the Internet Archive, up there basically for free, for everyone, forever. And all because I thought it might be kind of fun to put up every AOL CD-ROM. Now, you might not know this, but the Internet Archive actually has this kind of interesting feature, which is that if a file is a zip file or some other kind of archive file or an ISO file, you can actually right-click on the file's location, paste it in your browser window, and add a slash to the end. So you can actually say archive.org/download/item name/ISO name/, and it will try to unpack the contents of the ISO and be able to show you the files inside. And you can actually right-click and save them, or click on them and look at them. And in this way, you can actually browse a CD-ROM full of images on the Internet Archive immediately. It's not ideal, it's a little clunky, but it's a start. And once we have this data in this accessible form, that's when the treasure hunters show up. The fact is that for the stuff that I'm doing, people will sometimes find something really amazing. They'll say, this is a beta version of a game program that was put on a magazine cover CD, and nobody knew this existed. And did you know? And I'll say, of course not. None of this was touched by human hands. So much of the Internet Archive's uploads by me are being done by programs that, of course, I don't know that. All I know is that we put up this set of 40 CD-ROMs and we analyzed it and produced this disk image, and that's about it. I didn't look at it. Sometimes I'll write programs to go through items looking for something I care about, and I'll find every occasion of a text file or this kind of phrase, but that's not enough work. What's needed are people who are dedicated enough to plunge down into these massive banks of data and software on the archive and find those gems. I've been lucky to have the Shareware CDs make a difference. I was involved in a court case, I might add, that was being brought by a set of lawyers who had sued me something like 14 years previously, but it was about busting a patent, and you can't get me to move faster than to tell me I'm going to get to bust a patent. And there was a program that was released on a 1993 Shareware CD-ROM, and it was a program that enabled you to archive a bunch of documents and produce an index that lets you know what was on it. And somebody had a patent on things where you combined a bunch of files and you were able to look through them to know what was in them. And this person had made millions and millions of dollars off this patent. And they had been licensing it and, yes, patent trolling some of the biggest companies in the world like EMC. And basically, these companies were taking a shot at getting this software patent invalidated, and a lot of it rested on this CD-ROM. So off I went in my suit, and I gave a deposition with a recording while being interviewed by both the lawyers on the side of EMC and the other major players, and the group of people who were making millions off of it. And they were relentless. They needed to prove that Shareware CD-ROMs weren't a thing, that zip files were too hard to unpack, that nobody would look at the documentation of a program, and I just answered and answered and answered. And at the end, there was one more invalidated goddamn patent in the world. And sometimes it's simply a case where a game historian needs a certain copy of QuickTime to be installed before they can try a certain version of a program. And they asked me, do you know where I could get the installation program? And I asked when it came out. They told me. I then hit every game cover CD on the Internet Archive until I found ones that were within that period of time. And then I ran through their file contents until I found QuickTime installation programs. And in doing so, found that version of QuickTime. And this is barely scratching the surface. There are now terabytes of shareware up on the Internet Archive. There's terabytes of GIFs and JPEGs and BMPs from all throughout the computer age, the microcomputer age, when we didn't know what these machines were going to do, and we were trying everything on them. As it turns out, they're going to do everything. But now they're phones. Now they're servers, all bundled together somewhere and pretending that they're a cloud. We have an entire different relationship to computing power. And buried in these CD-ROMs is endless memory and history of when we all thought that these little plastic machines were going to change the world. And now, when it turns out we were right, what an incredible panoply of history these beautiful little discs are going to turn out to be. This is Jason Scott. You've been listening to the Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It podcast. Thanks to James Bekoyanu, Sam Johnston, and the hundreds of other supporters who have been contributing through Patreon, LibrePay, and even PayPal to helping me get out of debt. The last of my 2018 tax forms have arrived, and it is going to be zesty. Between all sorts of fundraising I did to try to pay off older debts and the Patreon money, it's going to probably be a pretty notable tax hit. I'm quite interested to find out, but I want to be clear. I used to be so terrified of taxes because I knew that there were all of these stumbling blocks and ways I could get things wrong. And when I first got that $35,000 tax bill a couple years back, that was the reckoning of years of not understanding what I was doing and just trying to smart my way through it. And over time, through the contributions of others and paying out from my salary, we've been able to turn it to a much lower number. So in many ways, that's great. So now when I talk with my accountant and I provide all of this documentation and he'll go through the numbers and tell me if there's any deductions that I missed or any other things I can do, it's going to be just another process. It's going to be something I do as part of my day and part of my life. I think of it as the last major thing in becoming an adult for me. It took a long time, but here I am, trying to be responsible, trying to keep fiscally on top of things and be able to work on the things I do and share everything I do and make the world a better place. You're helping me do that, and I appreciate that very much.